I'm Marion Dry, co-chair with Jonathan Sprague of Class Act HR 73. 7 years ago, a group of 7 members of the Harvard Radcliffe class of 73 founded Class Act, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization to provide a vehicle for our classmates to work together to create positive change. Today, we count ourselves several hundred strong. Our work focuses on 4 areas: social justice and civic engagement, education, health, and the environment. And our reach is local, national, and international. With the support of the Harvard Alumni Association, we are sharing the Class Act model with leaders of other classes, and several classes are creating their own Class Acts. The movement is growing. To learn more about our work, please go to our website, classacthr73.org. Before we begin, a few important things. First, Class Act is a nonpartisan organization. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this forum belong solely to the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of Class Act HR 73. This is a Zoom webinar, which means only the panelists can be seen and heard. But we want you who are attending to be able to participate, so here's how. If you have a question that you would like answered toward the end of the panel, please ask it at any time by typing it into the Q&A section. If you would like to make a comment or post some information, you can do that in the chat. Class Act will be using the chat to post links to articles, videos, websites, panelists' Twitter handles, and practical advice for the Zoom webinar platform. We will be live tweeting as well using the handle #ClassActForum, and we encourage you to retweet. Both the videos and the chat will be available on our website within a week, and we'll notify you when they're up. We encourage you to share them widely. It is now my great pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Alelia Bundles. A former network television news executive and producer at ABC News and NBC News, Alelia Bundles is a vice chairman of Columbia University's Board of Trustees and chair emerita of the board of the National Archives Foundation. She was a Radcliffe College trustee and one of the last presidents of the Radcliffe College Alumni Association. And she serves on the advisory board of the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute. The author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother. The book was the inspiration for Self-Made, the 2020 Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. Alelia is now at work on her 5th book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, Alelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance, about her great-grandmother. Alelia, welcome.
Marion, totally a pleasure to be here with you. And to be able to introduce our wonderful panelists. Brief introductions, because we know they all have amazing accomplishments, but I will start with Bill Kristol, who is a founding director of Defending Democracy Together and editor-at-large of The Bulwark for many years at the Weekly Standard. He served in senior positions in the administrations of President Ronald Reagan and President George Herbert Walker Bush. Before coming to Washington, he taught politics at the University of Pennsylvania and at Harvard. And Bill is a member of the Harvard Radcliffe class of 1973 and also received his PhD from Harvard. It is my pleasure to also introduce Dr. Chad Williams, who is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University, specializing in African American and modern United States history, African American military history, and World War I era and African American intellectual history. He recently was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard and received his undergraduate degree from UCLA and his PhD from Princeton. And finally, Nadine Strossen is the immediate past president of the American Civil Liberties Union and professor emerita at the New York Law School. As a leading expert on constitutional law and civil liberties, she has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. The National Law Journal named her one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. She graduated from Harvard and Radcliffe in 1972 and from Harvard's Law School in 1975. So welcome, Chad, Nadine, and Bill. Everybody's on. So we've bitten off a big topic, or at least the class act has bitten off a big topic for us. So let's talk about terms. Our title, Fascism, Are We There Yet? Surely is meant to be provocative. But let's start with what we individually mean when we say fascism versus authoritarianism versus illiberalism. How do each of you define the term? Bill, let's start with you.
I mean, fascism has a particular historical meaning, obviously, going back a century now, more than a century to Italy, and was much analyzed and by many people who taught us at Harvard in the 70s, and its relationship to other forms of authoritarianism and dictatorship and illiberalism. I tended not to use the term here in the US just because it comes out of a particular historical context. My friend Bob Kagan wrote a piece in 2016 saying, let's be realistic, let's be serious about what we're seeing with Trump. It is a kind of fascism. And I remember talking with him and saying, I don't know, maybe just authoritarianism is a safer, broader term. And he reminded me that I think it was Sinclair Lewis, maybe in the 30s, who wrote about this and said, when fascism comes to America, it'll come, of course, with distinctive American characteristics. So as long as we understand that, I just worry sometimes that we're going to start analyzing, 1922 in Italy or 1933 Germany and sort of miss what's distinctive here. And it's a long time later, and there are a lot of things that exist now that didn't exist then, and vice versa. And it's a very different country. But I think it is, to the degree that people use it to convey the gravity of the threat, the seriousness of the threat to liberal democracy, to the freedoms, to the constitutional order that we're used to honoring in the US, if we don't always live up to it, but still, I think they're right to sense that this is a special moment, not just a normal political fight, not just people we disapprove of strongly in terms of public policy, but a real threat to the norms and institutions of liberal democracy. And one that might begin with the election of one individual and a few norms being broken in the federal government, but can spill over into other levels of government and into the society and the culture as a whole. So in that respect, it's authoritarianism, it's illiberalism, it's a deep problem. I'm not sure if fascism is necessarily the best term for it, though.
Right, because sometimes people hear that term and then their ears turn off. So we're trying to give some definition. Chad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate all those comments. I think that's a really helpful start. I mean, we could think of fascism again in its really early 20th century roots as a type of governing philosophy based on dictatorial leadership, suppression of opposition, rooted in a type of ultra nationalism. But I think when we talk about fascism, and Bill, you speak to this, I mean, really it's defined by its haziness, right? It's defined by the inability to clearly define it. I think we can point to a number of different features, characteristics, perhaps even tropes surrounding fascism, whether it's kind of this sense of nostalgia for a mythic past, a type of focus on cultural regeneration, and a embracing of type of hyper-militarism, particularly amongst paramilitary groups, delegitimizing of political opposition, a type of hyper-masculinity. So I mean, there's all these different traits to fascism, which I think that we can kind of clearly identify in our current moment. But our challenge is, how do we make sense of that? And how do we think about what we're seeing in the context of the United States, kind of within the context of the United States, right? How do we root what we're seeing now, whether we want to term it fascism or something else, kind of clearly rooted in the long duration of American history, right? I mean, going back before the term fascism even existed, right, in the political lexicon. So I think we need to be clear about how what we're seeing today is really pulling from history in very powerful ways. And we're also experiencing the reckoning with that as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. Nadine?
Thank you both for those wonderful introductions to the subject. I say introductions because it's a bottomless subject. I personally, when we were doing the planning, asked if we could use the synonym illiberalism because I find fascism so hyperbolic, as you indicated, Alelia. It kind of turns off people as a valid criticism. And yes, you know, my learned co-panelists are aware of the exact historical antecedents, but I think and have broken down very specific elements. But I think in everyday discourse and political discourse and media discourse, it tends to be used as a very conclusory condemnation for ideas that are disfavored. So to me, illiberalism is a preferable term because it gets to the roots that both Bill and Chad have pointed to, a threat to foundational elements of our liberal democracy. Not only as a political structural matter, but also as a cultural matter. And while I see that the current administration has certainly attacked so many important institutions that are essential to liberal democracy, including the media, including academia, including the whole system of checks and balances. I think it's also important and consistent with the nonpartisan nature of this forum to point out that there are attacks on really important pillars of liberal democracy that are coming from the opposite end of the political spectrum as well. Especially when we talk about cultural attacks on the area that I have been focusing most of my attention on for the last half dozen or so years is freedom of speech and academic freedom and an open inquiry. And to bring this very close to home, Harvard, alma mater for many of us, there recently was the most detailed study that was ever done, a detailed survey of college students. 20,000 college students were surveyed by FIRE, Real Clear Education, and a third organization. And it was just published within the last couple of weeks, which showed that, well, first of all, Harvard came out very poorly in terms of students feeling that they could comfortably express their views, could comfortably challenge professors, could comfortably write a letter to the student newspaper. It was very depressing to me to see how many students felt that they couldn't do that. And what was really dismaying was that overall, of all the students surveyed of all the different colleges and universities, more than 18% felt that it would at least sometimes be justified to use violence against a speaker whose views they opposed. So there are tendencies toward illiberalism that are deeply permeating many sectors of our culture and society, including those where we would hope that liberalism would be most entrenched and durable.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine. So, and there are so many things every single day, I think, that we're inundated now. It seems like I'm drawn to headlines that say fascism that come 10 or 12 every day, and incidents that might make us think that we're in a very unusual period of time. Bill, you know, when we were preparing for this conversation, you talked about American exceptionalism. And how we've been able to marginalize some of these extremist tendencies. Do you think we're in, I mean, you sort of referenced this in your introductory remarks. Are we in an unusual, unprecedented time?
Yeah, it's funny, before the term American exceptionalism became kind of a flag waving term of the right in the last, rather recently, I think 10, 15 years maybe, it was a social science term, and it was, I think, it came from Europe, from Germany. Seymour Martin Lipset, who taught at Harvard, was one of the major American sociologists, political scientists who studied it. And it was really an attempt to answer from a sort of social science point of view, the question, Europe, most European nations featured a rather strong communist movement of different kinds of communist movements, but far left, beyond democratic socialist movements. And then some forms of fascist movements or right-wing authoritarian movements, usually both. And as we know, a lot of Europe succumbed to that. America never really had as major parties that. And I think race is a particular case, and you could argue there was something analogous to America, obviously, in the suppression of African Americans, legal and extra legal. But leaving that aside for a minute, I mean, and I don't mean to leave it aside fully, but America sort of managed to marginalize from, and most of the social scientists who studied this, some gave credit to the Madisonian system, some gave credit to the fact that we're a large country and people could move west and find land and didn't sit and, didn't feel discriminated against, not discriminated against, but feel that they didn't have a chance to rise. There was more upward mobility here. Nation of immigrants, a lot of different groups. There was a little less of an in versus out thing. So there are many explanations of this, and not worth getting into right now, and I don't even remember a lot of it. But it was an interesting social science debate. But it did capture something. There was something, we were spared a lot of the worst horrors, except on the issue of race and treatment of Native Americans, I would say, and to some degree, racial and ethnic minorities more generally. We were spared the worst horrors of Europe. And it is striking to me when you look at what's happening today, is it feels more like what one reads about in Europe. I think Chad mentioned a lot of these elements. I think very, use of glorification of force, real demonization of one's opponents and of minorities and of the other, of different kinds of others, a kind of rabble rousing against the press and against anyone who stands in your way, a kind of cult figure almost of the leader. It's all somewhat comical and buffoonish here in a way, and it's not maybe therefore ultimately as threatening as it could otherwise be. But these things can start off as sort of ridiculous and end up being extremely dangerous. I would say in both in the sense that you can be an ineffectual authoritarian and still do a lot of damage to a country. And you can be an somewhat ineffectual authoritarian who unleashes things that are then taken advantage of 3 or 10 or 15 years later by a much more effectual authoritarian. And that, for me, the last 4 years, I'll just put it in this way, and I'm anti-Trump, so I'll put it in terms of Trump. I won't apologize for that. But look, I mean, I could have always imagined that in a multi-candidate primary, someone I very much disapproved of, a real demagogue, someone who was willing to say racist things in a very overt way and terrible way, could win a Republican primary. I mean, I could always imagine that person then maybe could win the general election, especially if he had a somewhat unpopular opponent and got lucky and was helped by the Russians and by Jim Comey and all kinds of things. What I really didn't expect, I've got to say, is the total collapse then of the entire Republican Party before that person, and the collapse of an awful lot of business elites, at least conservative business elites and conservative intellectual elites before that person when he became president. I think the history of the last, I think we'd be in a very different place today. If we had, TV apprentice host, rabble rouser, pretty shameless demagogue, pretty determined to, use government to enrich his own family, pretty willing to exploit divisions and hatreds, Donald Trump as president. But when he did a lot of those things, an awful lot of members of Congress of both parties stood up to him. An awful lot of conservative elites stood up to him. An awful lot of business types said, no, you can't do that. I'm not going to cooperate with the administration on its legislative agenda or its judges or anything if you go that far. And what's been amazing is the total collapse of that, which incidentally is something that people studied a lot in the European context, also in the context of the American South. If you think about it, in the late 19th and early 20th century, where respectable people went along with something that they presumably didn't quite applaud deep down, but they found it convenient not to oppose much and to rationalize, to turn their eyes away. So for me, that's really worrisome thing, that it's not just one person. It is now a party that's problematic. It's a movement, a conservative movement, which is I've been part of, and which I think has done some good things and has a pretty big, pretty hefty, place in recent American history, and other institutions that have now sort of gone along. So, and of course, it does lead to reactions that can be equally, or not equally perhaps, but also very damaging. So, yeah, the willingness of people to sort of entertain thoughts of violence, for example, and okay, fine. So there've always been some crazy people, and there've always someone's always had a kooky idea about kidnapping a governor that they didn't like. We've never had a situation when the president of the United States didn't immediately denounce that, immediately call up that governor. There was bipartisan statements that this is absolutely intolerable. People really do make sure, look at their own behavior and restrain themselves a little bit as to what they've been saying, in case they've been inadvertently, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, inadvertently encouraging this kind of extremism and violence. None of that this time. One day later, the president of the United States, not a senator, a governor, a regional leader, a racial provocateur. Those people can do a lot of damage, but still, the president of the United States goes to that state and just talks about lock them up, and she deserves to get whatever, whatever happens to her, whatever he said. We need to take things into our own hands. I mean, that is really dangerous. And so for me, it's the presidency combined with the enabling institutions that's made this such a dangerous moment.
Thanks, Bill. So, and Chad, I think Bill has kind of teed up some of the things that you've talked about in terms of the intersection of race and exceptionalism, but the idea that perhaps domestic terrorism and fascism have always been a part of the political reality. Maybe they are, more accelerated or, more intense at the moment, but can you talk a bit about how you see this?
Yeah, really interesting points, but I'm maybe at some point we can come back to this kind of question of origin stories and how do we kind of pinpoint the origins of Trumpism? I mean, whether it's in kind of the evolution of the Republican Party since the late 1960s, early 70s, or perhaps we need to go back to an earlier period, maybe even back as far as the 1930s, when American fascism, I would argue, had a visible presence in this country. And to your point, Lee, I think of a quote from Langston Hughes. I believe it was in 1935. He was speaking to an audience. Langston Hughes, the great African-American poet, political activist, speaking to an audience about the moment that the country found itself in and the moment that African Americans found themselves in. And he said, in America, Negroes don't have to be told what fascism is in action. We know. And I think what he's speaking to, and what many other African Americans were speaking to in the 1930s, is their own experiences historically and in that moment with what they saw as American fascism. Right. So I always encourage my students when we're talking about these issues, in class as they're working on their papers or whatever assignment, to really think about their optic, right? What is the optic? What's the lens in which they are looking at a particular moment in time, looking at a particular issue, and what are the type of questions that they then ask as a result of the optic that they're employing? So for me, the question isn't necessarily, are we there yet? The question is, have we already been here? And I think when we look at the Black experience in this country, the answer could very well be yes. Right? When we think about the different elements of fascism, some of which I talked about earlier, a sense of racial and cultural purity, restricting of democratic rights, the crushing of political dissent, paramilitary, as well as state-sanctioned violence, all of these elements have been central to the Black experience in this country. We can even look at an organization like the Ku Klux Klan emerging after the Civil War, right? Being really one of arguably the world's earliest kind of fascist movements, right? So I think what we could take from this moment that we're in as we're having conversations about fascism, liberalism, authoritarianism, is that they allow us to have a different optic of understanding the Black experience in this country, the centrality of race, but also to understand America, to understand American history as troubling and as disconcerting as it might be. But there's 2 points that I think I want to maybe elaborate on a little bit. And the first has to do with history, right? I'm a historian, so folks, bear with me. But fascism really feeds on historical myths, right? Historical myths of national greatness and nostalgia for a pure, simpler time. Make America great again, right? But the question, of course, is what America are we talking about? And when was America great, and for who was it great? I think this is obviously very exclusionary, but I think when wielded kind of most perniciously, it's also very white supremacist as well, right? And I think there's a reason why we see the Confederate flag flying alongside Trump flags all over the country, right? There's a reason why we see these kind of various manifestations of white nationalism coming to the fore, right? They've always been there, but now they are clearly coming to the surface. I also think it's why we see kind of attacks on something like the 1619 Project, right? Which kind of compels us to rethink the origin story of America and the centrality of race in this country's history, right? It's why we see what I think are really incredibly ill-informed and anti-intellectual attacks on critical race theory and anti-racist forms of education, right? So I think, history really matters, and the ways in which history has been challenged by Black people in this country's past, and how we seeing the backlash to that now. And related to that, the second point that I'll just quickly emphasize is the reaction to our Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter being a response to the problem of racist policing, right? And the disproportionate killing of Black people. Now that's a problem that we should all want to address, right? But instead, we get the labeling of Black Lives Matter as racist, un-American, as a terrorist organization, the empowering of white militias, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, or whoever else is out there, very reminiscent to some of the fascist groups in the 1930s. We get this focus on law and order, this really dangerous politicization of the police and law enforcement, as opposed to focusing on the importance of protecting and serving, the criminalization of certain elements of our citizenry, and of course, criminalizing peaceful protests, right? This moment that we've experienced where literally millions of people from all walks of life, young, rich, poor, urban, suburban, across ethnic lines, across racial lines. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. But that's the type of America that has terrified a lot of people, and still does. The difference now is that some of the people who are terrified are now in the White House, who are now running the government. So I think our challenge is to really understand kind of what's happening in terms of race, to be honest about it, but to also insist that this is not the America that we want to live in.
Thank you, Chad. You said we'll try to get back to the origin story, and I like the fact that you talked about the origin story. And Bill, I will say that I just read an article in the Bulwark about the president's executive order about history. So I would love for us to be able to speak about that. Nadine, so we've been seeing disturbingly high levels of hateful speech and hate crimes. Yet the United States is virtually alone in the world in treating hate speech as constitutionally protected. There seems to be a growing sentiment to take lessons from other countries to restrict the type of speech that has the potential to fuel discrimination and violence. And all of you have mentioned violence. So what do you think about that approach?
Well, I am firmly committed to fighting discrimination, hatred, stereotyping, not to mention fascism. I wrote a book a couple of years ago, I'll hold it up here, called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And note that the only verb in that title is resist. I am absolutely committed to resisting the tide of hatred, and not least of which, let me say, tying together some themes that Chad and Bill talked about. My father was a victim of Nazi persecution in Germany. Many of his relatives were slaughtered by the Nazis. He was young enough that they used him for slave labor instead, although their slave labor was a system of working people to death rather than gassing them to death. So believe me, if I thought that censoring more than we do in this country, or censoring more than Germany did during the Weimar Republic, would have prevented the rise of fascism, would prevent hatred and hateful violence today, I would be all in favor of it. But the historical record and the current record are to the contrary, and I am absolutely convinced that it is precisely those who are resisting, those who are oppressed, those who do not have political power because they are members of racial minorities or religious minorities or political minorities, are the ones who absolutely depend on a robust freedom of speech. Now, that said, Alelia, I really want to get away from a binary that too often oversimplifies these debates about speech. The United States allows, correctly in my view, punishment of a great deal of hateful speech. The question is whether we should allow even more authority to government to punish hateful speech. So in a nutshell, we allow speech to be punished, including speech with a hateful message, if in a particular context, it directly causes certain serious, specific, imminent harm, such as what lawyers call a true threat, targeted harassment, targeted bullying, intentional incitement of imminent violence, and certainly hate crimes, which you referred to in your question. Certainly those can be punished with so-called enhanced penalties. That is, when something that is already a crime, such as an assault or vandalism, is committed against a particular person or a particular institution because of a discriminatory motive on the basis of race, religion, gender, so forth, that can and should be punished as a hate crime. Now, the problem in the Weimar Republic was not that they were not punishing hate speech. They had hate speech laws that went much further than in the United States, and basically followed what is now still followed in Germany and many other European countries. Speech that conveys a hateful message, even if you can't show any direct connection to likely harm or violence, just because the idea is hateful, it can be suppressed. And there were many prosecutions in the Weimar Republic, including of leading Nazis, including of the notorious Julius Streicher, who was ultimately committed at the Nuremberg trials as well. And the leading Jewish organization at the time said that most of these prosecutions were carried out very capably. They weren't sabotaged. And obviously that was not enough to prevent the rise of Nazism. To the contrary, the Nazis treated these trials as propaganda platforms. They got attention and sympathy they otherwise never would have. The problem is that they got away with violence. They got away with literal murder and assault against Jews, other minorities, their political opponents, communists, socialists, and so forth. And this is why I'm really concerned in this country today. One of the readings that I suggested was it was a cover story in the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago by Janet Reitman. It's being turned into a book. I talked to her recently. She told me that the article is still basically accurate, that at every level of law enforcement in this country, from the FBI on down to local police, there has just been a dearth of sufficiently serious enforcement of criminal laws against violent acts, against conspiracy, against plot plotting violence by white nationalists and white supremacists. And law enforcement has been complaining, it's been drained of resources. This has not been treated as a sufficient priority, in part because one of the causal factors here was after 9/11, the biggest priority became so-called international terrorism, and efforts and attention and resources were channeled away from domestic terrorism, despite the fact that far more people have been killed in this country by white nationalists and white supremacists after the 9/11 attacks than by so-called Islamic or international terrorism. One other point, which is that in Germany and France today have probably the strongest anti-hate speech laws in the world, which are very strictly enforced. And I hope everybody who follows current events knows that those laws have not in any way headed off horrible violence against many minorities, including Jews, including refugees, including immigrants, including Roma. So let's keep our eyes on punishing the speech that is closely tied to violence. Let's use other speech as a resource to help law enforcement pinpoint those who are plotting or planning or engaging or threatening in violence. Their speech can actually be helpful to law enforcement, and let's ramp up law enforcement and domestic anti-terrorism efforts.
So thank you, Nadine. I just feel as if each one of you could, if we were at a dinner party, I would be just not knowing which way to turn. There's so much really great information. And I'm wondering if each of you might want to comment on what you've just heard. We have a few minutes. So were there any ideas that popped up that you wanted to respond to or expand upon?
Well,
Bill?
I'm amused by the idea of a dinner party. I guess I vaguely remember what that is, but
I know.
I guess we'll get back to some version of that at some point. That's not where we're not socially distanced on our porch for 6 or 8 people. There's so much to say, and I have some disagreements actually with Chad, a lot of agreements, and mostly agreements with Nadine actually. I guess I'd say this: you can look. There's a ton of history. There's a lot of sociology and culture involved in all of this, and it would be foolish as an intellectual matter to ignore all that. But I would just say, and this maybe is a little bit more hopeful, politics matters, leadership matters. I mean, at the end of the day, there are a lot of people around who have a lot of anxieties, a lot of hatreds, a lot of prejudices. There always have been. There probably always will be to some degree, no matter how much we try to educate them better and so forth. There'll always be losers in, the economic, whether it's democratic socialism or democratic capitalism. There'll be people who do less well in life, people who are unlucky, people who feel entitled and hate losing some privilege they might have fairly or unfairly from the past and so forth. A healthy political system tries to deal with a lot of these problems and grievances and anxieties, but also tries to make sure that they don't take over the system or any party or any part of government. An unhealthy system lets them take over and then sometimes tries to at least deal with them or manage them when they've taken over part of the government, and then that's not such an easy thing to do, and then it can get pretty bad, whether that's the American South in in the late 19th century, or whether it's obviously Europe in the 1920s and 30s. So, but political leadership does matter. It's not as if we have no idea in the US what responsible leadership would look like. And obviously we would have our differences, I'm sure, about what exact form of it we would all like, but I think we could agree there have been responsible leaders in both parties actually, and on liberal and conservative sides, who dealt with at least some of these issues, but they probably had blind spots as well. But those can be overcome by the next generation of leaders. So for me, thinking ahead, once we get past election day here, and maybe there's a little bit of a chance to breathe and to think harder about what can be done more structurally, more institutionally, but also just in terms of rhetorical leadership and making clear the price that we could end up paying for being so either irresponsible in what we do and what we endorse and what we tolerate, or at least negligent, even if we're not affirmatively doing anything terrible. Maybe it's an opportunity really for The next generation, we've had, one generation of leaders really since the end of the Cold War now, and maybe it's time for, and we'll have one more of that generation, and Joe Biden, if he wins, or Trump, actually, whoever wins will be in his 70s. But obviously, there's going to be a big generational change coming. That can be good, that can be bad. A lot of young people are more immune to a lot of these temptations of authoritarianism than older people. I think in the US they may be now, but historically, maybe not, as Nadine suggested in some ways. And also historically, a lot of these the worst movements were young people's movements, not necessarily old people. So we can't be complacent that, oh, young people are going to save us. But having said that, I think there is an opportunity now to get to have some real leadership that will deal with these problems, some of which go back decades, centuries, some of which are much more recent, some of which are technological, social media, some of which are particular to particular issues. So I'm not quite as pessimistic, I guess, is what I want to say, as maybe this whole discussion would lead one to think. But I will say that if we don't, but it's also very much worth having this discussion, because if not, we don't succeed, failure could be very ugly. I mean, I've been around for a while, and many people have, America may not step up, the 21st century may not be as good as the 20th century, but people's idea of failure has been sort of slow economic growth, or, sort of not being on the cutting edge of technology, perhaps, or not being able to do as much as we should be doing to help others around the world. Failure could be a lot uglier than we have tended to think. And so these stakes are very high, I think.
Thanks, Bill. Clearly one of the things that's been notable to me in my lifetime, when we're all about the same age, is just how much that pendulum can swing from one administration to the next, the mood of the country. Chad, thoughts that you have?
Yeah, quickly. I like quotes from some of my favorite people. And one of my favorite quotes is from James Baldwin. And this was an interview that he did with Kenneth Clark right after his famous meeting with Robert F. Kennedy. And Kenneth Clark asked him how he felt about the future of America. And James Baldwin said, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. And I think that speaks so clearly and powerfully to not just how I feel, but I think how we need to think about this moment, again, in the long kind of span of African American history, which has been rooted in a type of hopefulness for America and for redeeming this country's democracy, right? Recognizing America for what it can potentially be, and fighting like hell to make that happen. I studied W.B. Du Bois, who lived 95 years. And he devoted his entire life to fighting for democracy, recognizing the flaws of America, using the whole range of his intellectual and artistic gifts to fight for freedom for Black people, but recognizing, even as he was on his deathbed in Ghana, that America still was a place of wonderful potential. So I think we need to be clear-eyed, absolutely, while at the same time recognizing that in order for this country to get out of the condition that it's in, it's going to take a commitment to struggle, to historical honesty, and continuing to be hopeful in a very kind of centered way.
I would just like to add to both of those comments that in addition to great leaders that Bill and Chad have mentioned, mass movements and mass protests has really been responsible for an enormous amount of positive change in this country. I'm not an official historian, but looking at the history of civil liberties and civil rights in this country, as I'm telling friends now who are despondent about what might happen to the Supreme Court, for most of our history, it wasn't the Supreme Court that was issuing pro-civil liberties or pro-human rights or civil rights rulings. And a lot of the changes came about through grassroots struggles that ultimately manifested themselves in constitutional amendments and historic civil rights statutes. And so I think, to me, one of the really encouraging developments recently has, and Chad already alluded to it, protest movements that are so diverse in terms of who's participating, and that people are participating even despite anxieties about that are provoked by the pandemic. And obviously I support the right to peaceful assembly, not violence, but that is what most people are engaging in. And that's really important, not only to as an exercise of individual free speech, but really has been an engine for, I think, moving us closer and closer to our constitutional ideals, or the ideals in the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you, Nadine. We're going to go to questions from the audience, but before we do that, we had talked a bit about the internet and social media as a way to accelerate, both the ability to express oneself, to have peaceful protests, but also to spread authoritarian messages. So this is something, the internet, Facebook, which was started at Harvard, some of these things have made this particular moment different. Do you have thoughts, any of you, about how the role the internet plays, or social media, and then some of these sort of offline things that are quite secret? Bill?
Just a word. I mean, new technologies, do some wonderful things, and also obviously provide more ability for people to do terrible things. I mean, we know that through history. The radio, I mean, we take it for granted now. Politicians speak on the radio. Hitler was actually the first, I think, national politician to really exploit the radio to go around what we would consider to be the kind of intermediate institutions that used to report on what politicians would say and speak directly to the people. And again, that's not a bad thing. I don't think we want to get rid of, televised or radio addresses from politicians or anyone else these days, but and it would be impossible to do in any case. But it probably was not an insignificant part of his demagoguery. Now, Churchill also spoke on the radio, and FDR had fireside chats. So, one doesn't want to overdo this. But I do think social media, I think the internet in general, we had a pretty good piece of the Bulwark, you mentioned it, the Bulwark. So so 10 years ago, when everyone looked at I know this is true in the academy, my professor friends, you looked at the internet, it was like Wikipedia. What is that going to be about? I mean, that's going to be crazy. People are just putting up things there. It's going to be totally, fact-free zone. Students are going to use it. And how are we going to ever have reliable sources of information again? Now, I'm sure I know Wikipedia is not perfect, and maybe it's not quite as good as the Encyclopedia Britannica used to be, but I don't think Wikipedia is destroying American democracy. And if anything, I find it personally, we just need to look something up, like when did, Mussolini come to power or something, it's actually reasonably useful. And, the crowdsourcing seems to work reasonably well, except in a few kind of bizarre circumstances. Thinking seriously, this is one of the many things that needs to happen, is to really think seriously about these different parts of the internet. It's a pretty concrete and tough public policy question, I think, about how, if we do want to have freedom of speech, a lot of the democratization is great. I don't think we all would be very happy in a world with the gatekeepers that were there 50 years ago or 100 years ago. A lot of bad things happened then too. But I think thinking through, the algorithms of Facebook and how those are the Facebook's its business model, the privacy questions of who owns the information and so forth. There's a lot of hard work to do. And one of the problems with the last 4 years, frankly, that was people were kind of getting interested in that. I think there was some useful debates beginning. For the last 4 years, there's been almost no debate about any public policy, because everything has been, of course, and I don't criticize this, I'm part of the problem too. Everything's about Trump, resisting Trump, how do we do this, that, which is necessary, I think. But we do need to get serious about a ton of issues, whether it's economic power or, new technologies, and of course, a million other things. And I think that's a very important one, actually.
Chad?
Yeah, I think, in the long span of protest movements, and particularly in the long history of the civil rights movement, technology has always played an incredibly important role, whether it's photography in the 19th century, radio, television. You can make an argument that the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s would not have happened um, unfolded in the way that it did if it wasn't for the power of television. So I look at the internet and social media in particular as kind of continuing that historical tradition, but also the problems that come along with it. We can look at we can certainly look at the Black Lives Matter movement and its reliance on social media as being really important and decisive. But I think it also raises a lot of questions, and Nadine, you could probably speak better to this, is just how we think about kind of the question of regulation. So if we acknowledge that we are in a moment of fascism, ultra nationalism, illiberalism, whatever term we want to use, that the moment that we're in is not healthy for democracy. To what extent do we try and regulate a space like the internet and particular social media sites? Does that regulation come from the state, recognizing that the state as it exists now is the purveyor of the type of problems that we're confronting, or is it come from the private sector? Do we look to private businesses to self-regulate, and what incentive do they have to do that other than being concerned about the civic good? So I think there's some interesting questions there, but social media, internet, definitely a double-edged sword.
Nadine, thanks, Chair. Nadine, you are muted.
Very, very tough questions. And I'm happy to say that there are individual members of Congress very seriously studying these issues and their complexity, and certainly many academic experts. When it comes to the dangerous information on the internet, the hateful speech, the disinformation, the malinformation, extremist content, and so forth, one question that I always ask people to think about is, who should decide, right? It's very bothersome to have the titans of Silicon Valley making these decisions. And yes, they have fostered a lot of free speech for Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements, but they've also been very censorious. And Black Lives Matter activists, pipeline protesters, others on the left are complaining that they are being disproportionately censored under these very vague, non-transparent content moderation rules that these private sector entities wield. For all practical purposes, they have more censorial power than all governments throughout history around the world, right? Facebook alone is taking down, by its own counts, millions of what they call hate speech messages every month. And so there's something very discomforting about their having taken over a function or occupying a role that historically has been occupied by the government, the public square, for all of us to exchange and debate ideas with each other and with those we elect to represent us. On the other hand, I'm very uncomfortable about having the government come in and regulate a private sector communications medium. Where I am right now is advocating, as a lot of digital rights activists have, that at the very least, there should be some process type protections. Maybe we can think of them as consumer protections, that we should at least be entitled to basic information about the algorithms that are being used to decide what we see, what communications we will receive, what news feeds we'll receive. We should know what those are, and we should have the ability to consent, because I think without that, you add this surveillance capitalism, which is monitoring in the most granular detail every aspect of our lives and projecting what our thoughts and our behavior will be. And you combine that with this news feed that is customized based on that surveillance. We don't really have meaningful freedom of thought in the classic liberal sense, right? Which means individual freedom to choose what ideas to engage with or not engage with. So I think these are it's a new kind of challenge.
Well, and apparently this idea of misinformation is really striking a nerve, because I'm looking in the chat, and I would have to thank Donna Brown Guillaume, class of 73, who is working behind the scenes and curating some of these questions. So I'm going to pose this question to the three of you. Democracy in the US has been undermined in part by the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories on social media. What is the best way to combat this misinformation? Merely fighting this misinformation with correct information doesn't seem to have been working particularly well. Well, you all sort of addressed that to some degree in the comments you just made, but that does make me think about the impact of QAnon. This is a phenomenon that we haven't seen, at least accelerated in the way that we have in recent months. Any thoughts on this conspiracy theory, QAnon, where that fits into this discussion on fascism?
I'll just say a word. Look, I mean, we've always had conspiracy theorists. We've had scapegoating. Joe McCarthy was before the internet and before Facebook, and so was George Wallace, and so were a ton of other people. So we shouldn't maybe overdo how new this is, but it takes new forms and it poses new challenges in terms of combating it. I do think the conspiracy theorizing is particularly dangerous because you can't falsify it. I mean, if someone has an extreme view on something, they can argue that view, but then someone presumably at some point enough evidence accumulates that an awful lot of people say, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, or that's not the right understanding of something or other. Whereas for conspiracy theories, you are in a kind of endless regress of the more you seem to disprove it, the more the conspiracy types say, no, that's just part of the deep state conspiracy covering up the earlier conspiracy. And that has me a little, spooked. I mean, the degree to which it's penetrated now and the craziness of it and its closeness to violence is not healthy, to say the least. And it is hard to know. And that is, I think, the real challenge. But I would say this, you could tolerate in a big free society, big, huge country like ours, bad news sources, stupid, bad Facebook groups, people telling each other nutty theories about how the government works. It is made much, much worse by having a president of the United States broadcast it, magnify it, preach tolerance of it, even lift it up in certain ways, right? I just think we can't underestimate. This is why I just don't know how bad the situation is. How bad would the situation be if we didn't have a president for 4 years pushing this? Would QAnon really be going anywhere, or would it be some scattered hundreds of thousands of people who can do some real damage, God knows, but who are not really, penetrating a major political party? Which does raise the question that if whatever got beyond Trump as president and had, relatively, let's just say, normal, more restrained political leaders, how much of this sort of goes away to some degree without that encouragement from the Oval Office, we've just never had. It's been a long, long time, at least, since we've had this kind of behavior from a president. We only have one president. It's a powerful position. This one uses it in a powerful way, you got to say, to encourage a lot of this stuff. And so it's hard to know how much of a problem it would be if he weren't there.
Thank you. Chad, any thoughts on conspiracy theories, QAnon?
I try not to pay there's too much attention to QAnon because it's just so out there. But I think the really critical question is, why are so many people even receptive to something so far-fetched as QAnon? What is the I don't know, what's the ferment that is allowing for these type of conspiracy theories to take hold? I certainly think that, Bill, to your point, that leadership matters, that when it's being legitimized from the highest levels of the government, that makes a critical difference. But I do think, it's important to really understand, so what's happening kind of in the ground, to allow these type of theories to take root, to fester, and then to manifest themselves in particularly dangerous ways. Again, we don't know how this is necessarily going to unfold, but I do think we're seeing enough warning signs that we need to take it seriously.
Nadine?
I would just like to add that the situation is going to get much worse in terms of disinformation when we are approaching the era of so-called deep fakes. What I've read about that is absolutely terrifying because there are some now, but they're actually quite crude, but they're going to become more and more sophisticated. And there is no way that we're going to censor or regulate our way out of this problem. The answer has to be, and this is kind of a quaint term, media literacy. And there are a lot of foundations and universities and others that have been pouring resources into this because we absolutely have to educate ourselves starting at the earliest age to be able to make critical distinctions, do our own research, our own fact checking, our own investigations. Two of the articles that I recommended for inclusion in the background are studies, very short report, summaries of studies that have been done by teams of scientists at Stanford University using Stanford students. Now, maybe Harvard students would have done a lot better, but it was really shocking that these college students couldn't even tell the difference between an opinion piece or a news story. Didn't even have the idea that they should go beyond the four corners of the piece itself that they are looking at, so that if it looked highly produced, that to them was indicia of credibility. Now, the good news is that seemed to me to be rather low-hanging fruit. We should be able to educate, make a lot of progress through basic education, equipping people to inoculate themselves against being subject to fake news or conspiracy theories.
So it's interesting that I'm seeing questions where people really do want to have advice on how to combat this. So I think if all of you could do that, you would all get $1 million tonight. But are we there yet? Fascism, are we there yet? Are the alarms going off in your head? Bill, since we start with you each time, why don't we go there? You're muted. You are muted.
Bad being started with each time, but I guess, look, we're not there yet. Pretty obviously, we have a lot of troubling and alarming signs. And I think more than I would have expected even 4 years ago, let's say, when Donald Trump won, or more than I would have expected at different stages during the last 3 or 4 years. And I am particularly worried about the spread of demagoguery. It's one thing to have a demagogue, it's something to have tens of millions of people responding to that. It's another thing to have organizations forming and groups forming that are motivated by hatred and by conspiracy theories. Again, all of this has happened in the past, but having it come together to the degree it is now is, I think, genuinely, I'm more alarmed than I was. Having said that, I think there are also huge forces that cut the other way in America and in the world, actually, in large parts of the world at least. And again, I come back to this, it's such a cliche, and I hate to say it in some silly way, but I mean, the people afterwards explain, well, Germany had to become Germany because of, I don't know, Martin Luther or the 19th century or World War I or the Depression. And it's all not, I mean, of course, there are underlying forces that push you in a certain direction. Or this, the South, after the Civil War, it had to go the way it went in terms of Jim Crow and 1876 and 1896 and so forth. But it didn't have to go that way in each of these cases. And in good cases, to talk about protest movements, it didn't have to go the good way either. I mean, there's too much, this is my main complaint with progressives, they sort of do, a lot of them do believe that the arc of history bends towards justice, which is a nice thought, but you know what, we should make sure it bends in the right direction, and it can bend in a pretty bad way. And so I think a lot of it is up to us, and up to both everything from mass movements to leadership of individual institutions to leadership of the nation. I mean, obviously it's a huge country, and I think many chances to have an influence in all kinds of different ways, and hard to predict who has an influence where. Who would have predicted the particular people who made the most difference in the 50s and 60s? I don't know. Some of the somewhat chancy and somewhat people emerge, and it's the right person at the right time. So I feel that there's huge opportunities, but I think it's a mistake to be complacent and assume that it's all going to just kind of wash out, or the system will take care of it, or we don't need to really be intentional, I guess is the way I would put it, about defending our freedoms, about defending liberal democracy, about thinking about how different technologies and institutions and historical factors fit into the prospects for liberal democracy. And we can't just sort of say, well, I think these things have kind of worked out in the past, you know, there were technological breakthroughs, we live with them today, this next one's not going to be a problem. It can be very bad before you get to the other side of the problem. So I feel like we're in 10, 20, 30 years now of a very fluid and problematic situation, which is a huge challenge, huge opportunities, but real challenges.
So Bill, I will just tell you, some of us would like to think that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, but we're finding out it doesn't necessarily. Chad?
Yeah, again, I'll go back to my earlier point about just the fuzziness of terms. And I mean, I think American fascism isn't going to be called fascism. It's going to be called something else. And that's the challenge, right? Of thinking through the moment that we're in, and taking account for it on its own terms. So with that being said, I don't think that we are in a moment of fascism. I think that we are seeing many elements of fascism manifesting themselves in our current moment. But I take some comfort in the fact that we are currently in the midst of an election, right? People are voting, that our democratic process is still functioning. It may be damaged for some people, it may even be on life support, but it's still there. And you know, we'll certainly have to see what happens in the upcoming weeks. But there are still people fighting, and that makes a difference. There are still people who are committed to trying to preserve the democratic institutions of this country, to try and redeem America. And you know, I think that's really important to keep in mind, and to also keep in mind that, you know, we can't predict what's going to happen. We can do our best to use history to inform the present, but we're not fortune tellers. Who knows what might happen tomorrow? So I think we just need to certainly be vigilant, stay in the moment, but recognizing the power that we do have to try and make change.
So to go back to your James Baldwin quote, you know, we have to keep our eye on the prize.
Absolutely.
Nadine?
Well, obviously, I'm an optimist. You can't be an activist without being an optimist. And over the course of history, we, the people, have bent the arc toward justice and made enormous strides. I mean, if you really look at all of American history, at the time the ACLU was founded, exactly 100 years ago this year, I mean, not only did we have Jim Crow prevalent and women had just barely won the right to vote, would win the right to vote later that year, but people were arrested in the thousands merely for peacefully expressing opposition to government policies. And, you know, the United States Supreme Court had never enforced the First Amendment to protect freedom of speech, and states were not bound to protect any rights at all under the US Constitution. So, you know, the strides that we made through the 20th century were enormous. And I say that obviously not at all saying let's rest on our laurels, but for exactly the opposite reason. We should be so encouraged that we can continue. And I think the momentum is very, very much on the side of our grand national ideals of liberty and justice for all. One of the geniuses of the Constitution is the separation of checks and balances and federalism. So we've seen states and local governments really come to the fore and take leadership on issues where the national government has been in default. We have seen some brave civil servants really take the lead, and when those in political power are not doing so. And I couldn't agree more with Chad and Bill, Alelia, I think you've said this as well, that every single one of us really can make a difference. We do it by informing ourselves through participating in events such as this, through reading as much as we can, and fact checking, and reading multiple sources, and speaking. I mean, it may seem like a very small step, but I don't turn down any invitation, especially to speak to a high school or to a middle school or a teachers group or a community organization. People seem to have a hunger now that we're all stuck at home to do these events by Zoom. You've got such knowledgeable people that are in the audience here. I'm sure they would, their local Rotary clubs and schools would love to have them come speak. Just basic. Here's another old-fashioned quaint term along with media literacy. Civics education has been so lacking. We could do so much by just going in and talking to students about the government, about history. How does the government work? How have we achieved what progress we have made throughout history toward fuller human rights for more of us? It may seem very small, but if we multiply it by all of the people of goodwill in this country, that's what's going to keep democracy alive and bring us closer to the founding ideals and fend off fascism and illiberalism.
So I think that you must have been sort of in my head, because the word civics was right there with me. I feel as if we have a civics lesson every single day for the last 5 years. Sometimes it turns out, Bill, the arc of the moral universe is going in the right direction, and sometimes not. But this hour has really flown by. I am just so grateful to you, Nadine and Chad and Bill, for really educating us and sharing your thoughts with us, and to the class of 1973 for bringing us together, for really selecting great panelists. And I'll hand it back to Marian Dry.
Thank you, Alelia, and thank you, Chad and Nadine and Bill. This has been remarkable. Your analysis is so helpful to all of us, and also your optimism. And I appreciate the words of all of us getting out and trying to do something. Class Act itself always has calls to action at the end of these forums, and ours are not dissimilar to what you've just said. We encourage everyone here to continue to educate yourself on this topic. We will be sending you all of the links from today within the next week, and so you can read those. Please share them, the resources, with your friends and with your family. And I hope that many of you have already voted, but if you have not, please make a plan, make sure your friends have a plan, and support others who access to voting. So our thanks go to, as I said, our panelists and wonderful Alelia, but also to the members of our production and program teams for this evening: Donna Brown-Guillaume, Rick Brotman, Sarah Greenberg, Therese Steiner, Sarah Ulrich, Diana Labanchu, and Katie Marinello. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all of you tonight, and good evening.
Thank you.